Now, the pace at which the coronavirus is changing our lives is speeding up and, frankly, getting ever more complex. In a major change, the Department of Health has announced a new speeding up coronavirus test, which can give us a yes-no result in about 90 minutes or thereabout. We could, in fact, from this week, be under pressure to cast the kitchen table Zoom meetings into history and return to the workplace. Employers indeed have the power to insist that we do. From today, diners can get 50% off their meals out, subsidised by the taxpayer, but in parts of England, local restrictions just got tougher, with some other areas under threat of a local lockdown. And in Leicester, restrictions just got easier. You following? Duncan Robertson is from Loughborough University School of Business and Economics and has been our guide through the numbers really all the way since March. Duncan, hi.
Good morning, Ben.
So look, first of all, give us an update on numbers, particularly as regards Leicester.
Well, I think so. This kind of peak that happened in Leicester started about 8 weeks ago. You see in the numbers, went up to about 140 cases per 100,000. Now we're down to about 50. And 50 is about the cut-off that other governments, say the German government, use for these sort of lockdown-type things.
Yeah.
And basically, so we're definitely going down. So the trend is definitely down in Leicester. And, I think, as you say, the lockdown measures are being released gradually. And I think, it's positive signs for Leicester. But, of course, it depends what people do. If people think, well, it's all going well and then just go back to mixing, then, of course, it can go back up again. But the trend is downwards at the moment, which is very good news.
Wasn't it always going to be a bumpy ride up, down, over some considerable time?
Well, I think that's right, and I think that the difficulty when you look at that sort of national picture, and that's what was happening at the beginning of the epidemic, when we just really had data on what was happening in the whole country, and now we're getting this more local data down to local authority level. In the case of Leicester, and Public Health England now publish the number of cases down to kind of ward levels, which is just a few thousand people. So we can get a much more sort of accurate measurement of what's going on, particularly within local authorities, but down to ward level now. And that data is on the Public Health England website. So you can see what's going on much more clearly now.
But am I right in thinking that ONS data, Office for National Statistics data, suggests, though, that there is an uptick nationally?
Exactly, and that was the sort of, I think that was what prompted the intervention by the Prime Minister a few days ago, where you can see actually this trend is going up and nationally. And the problem with that is, as we know, what looks to be just an increase of a few can slowly get out of control and go this sort of exponential rise that happened, back in March. And that's what I think the government's trying to at least slow down.
And are these local lockdowns the way to do that?
Well, I think, it really is the balance. When I came on, I think in March, it was the first question was, what's the balance between, the health of the population and the economy? And I think as time's going on, these national lockdowns have a huge effect on the entire economy. And of course, if you can try and minimise the effect, then that's a good thing. So if you look at places down in the southwest, for example, they've had very little incidents of coronavirus, but they've had to have the same sort of effects as everybody else. So I think what's going to happen is this local information and local lockdowns is the way forward. But as you say, that gets a little bit confusing. So, yeah.
Look, I think there's a message coming out from the government is we're about at the extent of where we can lift lockdown to. People are being encouraged to go back to work, to go out to dine and stuff. Will that have a further effect on that upward trend?
Well, I think, it depends how it's done. And of course, the government's always saying that there are these guidance, 2 metres, and then it went down to 1 metre plus. And of course, that 1 metre plus, the plus bit is if you have mitigation in place. So you might be outside or wearing masks. And I think if people, conform to those sort of rules, then, the incidents will remain relatively under control. But of course, if you're in a social situation or indeed in other people's houses, you tend to, act socially. And that means doing things that perhaps are outside the guidance. And of course, if the guidance is a little bit vague, people don't quite know what to do. So I think if you look at the Chief Medical Officer, he always looks a bit twitchy, a bit nervous. So I think, there's the sort of medical and scientific advice and there's the political advice, and they're always slightly, the politicians have this job to do to basically make the decisions using the advice of the scientists and chief medical officer. But I think you can see from the ONS data going upwards, we are basically very close to that limit of it taking off again. So it's a very difficult, bumpy ride.
Look, and this sort of edge towards some kind of normality, it's obviously very welcome for everybody, all of us. Just as an example, and I'm sure lots of people will have seen this too, I went to a do yesterday, which should have had thousands of people. I think there were probably 200 or 300, and that was because of social distancing. And it was all very nice and very pleasant and in a field and lovely. And yet, at the back of my head, there was this nagging thing: where do the economics of this all stand up? Because there were actually more people marshalling and making sure everybody was, following the rules, which they were. But the costs must have gone up, but the actual revenue must have been way down.
Well, absolutely. And I suppose that's what the government has been trying to do with these sort of furlough schemes and trying to get the economy as normal as possible. But of course, these sort of things are running out. And there are going to be huge issues. And of course, there's some people, like we can carry on this conversation normally just by phone, and that's great. And that sort of side of the economy will kind of continue. But it's the ones that require these sort of face-to-face contacts that, are these sort of social events, and perhaps events that aren't necessarily required but are nice to have, that are the ones that are potentially going to go. So, and they're a huge amount of the economy.
And just finally, as far as businesses and so on go, do you have any sense of, clearly, I think if you'd asked many businesses sort of 2 or 3 or even 4 weeks into the lockdown, would you like to get people back or stay at home doing Zoom meetings? They said, we want them back. But, 4 odd months into this, lots of processes have been put in place. In many cases, people are actually pretty happy working from home. Do you see a sort of a stampede of people getting back to working in a set building, or actually will there be a rise of people working at home permanently?
Well, I think for some people it works well, and some people it even works better. But I think people are nervous at the moment, and they're nervous about the mixing, and they're nervous about their employers taking appropriate measures. And if it works, I think that's fine, and you're lucky enough to be in a position where that's the case. So companies like Google have said basically into 2021, we're quite happy for people to work at home. And I think what's going to happen is over this winter period, when people are going to be potentially working in offices at close proximity with flu season as well, then people are perhaps going to be a little bit nervous about that. And that's why it's important for the government to have some sort of procedure in place to make sure people are confident in going back to work.
Duncan, as always, great to have you on and explain our way through this forest of figures. Thanks so much for coming on the show again.
Thanks, Ben. Thank you.
Thank you. There are Duncan Robertson from Loughborough University, our guide, has been our guide all the way through this. I suspect we have much more to talk to with Duncan over the coming weeks or so.